Right. Today we're going to deal with a major world religion called Buddhism. We have addressed in the earlier lectures the nature of religion. It's a way to orient people to the sacred redemptively. Of course, there are different worldviews behind the different religions, but I think in terms of a definition of religion, that's not too bad. Religions give an understanding of the human condition and what has to happen for people to relate themselves in the right way to what is sacred. That's very general, obviously. And we'll see that in Buddhism, we have a very different understanding of the ultimate reality, the human condition, salvation, the afterlife, than what we have in Christianity. And we then looked at atheism as a possibility, looked at Nietzsche's attack on Christianity, and worked with his saying, God is dead. We took a look also at Judaism, and the statement there we used was God's name that he gives in Exodus 3:14. I am who I am, a living, cognizant, knowledgeable being who interacts with the world through sending prophets and shaping history. And last week, we moved to a very different kind of religion than Judaism, but one of the most significant religions, that is Hinduism. And Hinduism has a variety of schools and a multitude of gods. I looked at one particular school or interpretation of Hinduism called non-dualism, and the phrase that I used for that, and this is coming out of my book, World Religion in 7 Sentences, was, you are that. Sort of a cryptic saying, but the meaning of it, metaphysically, religiously, is that you are one with everything, and everything is known as Brahman, or the universal self. So salvation is found by transcending your sense of individuality, which is ultimately an illusion, and merging and fusing with this one universal entity. And if you can attain that, you would no longer have to come back and be reincarnated through the demands of karma. Today I'd like to look at Buddhism, which is a successor to Hinduism. It's one of the three great missionary religions. You may not think of Buddhists as missionaries, but historically they have gone out into the world. There are approximately 376 million adherents of the different schools of Buddhism. There's the Theravada school, the Mahayana school, Zen Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, and so on. But all of the schools of Buddhism hold to something called the Four Noble Truths, which we will make the center of our analysis and critique. So Buddhism moved from India into what is now Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, then through Northern and Eastern Asia, and finally to China, Japan, the United States, and of course it's had an effect also on Europe. Now, when we talk about Buddhism, especially in the United States, we don't have a lot of people who would probably identify as Buddhists and regularly attend a Buddhist service. However, Buddhism as a kind of philosophy of life is very influential in America today and in the West in general, largely through this idea of mindfulness, which has now really permeated our society because we're a very anxious, overwrought people, and we're looking for peace of mind or tranquility. And Buddhism supposedly offers this through this meditative practice called mindfulness. And I don't have the time to give a critique of this, but it does come out of Buddhism. There's some elements of mindfulness that will not take you into the Buddhist religion. They're just ways of calming and stilling your mind, not being so anxious and fretful. But the deeper you get into the mindfulness, the more you move in the direction of the Buddhist worldview and something that is really very antithetical to Christianity. But many people who are not confessing Christians might say that they're Buddhists, even though they don't attend a Buddhist temple regularly. They're not from a country that's predominantly Buddhist like Thailand, but they might say, well, I think I'm basically a Buddhist. I practice mindfulness. I respect Buddha. I believe in reincarnation and karma and things like this. But we're not in a situation that one of my students was in years ago at Denver Seminary, where she came from Thailand, which is officially a Buddhist country. That's the official standard religion, established religion of Thailand is Buddhism. And she became a Christian, thanks be to God, in the United States. And a few years after that, she came to study with me in our philosophy of religion program at Denver Seminary. And she was going back to Thailand. And she said, people show respect to the Buddhist monks by bowing before them. Do you think I could do that as a Christian? It's common practice because Buddhism is in the marrow of Thailand. It is the established religion. Can I actually bow to the Buddhist monk? Have you ever had that problem? I've never had that problem. So we talked about it, and I thought, well, the bowing could certainly be a sign of respect for an older gentleman. It doesn't necessarily mean you're saying Buddhism is true. Now, bowing before a statue of Buddha is something else entirely. But we don't typically face those kind of problems. I think the kind of problems we face as Christians are twofold. One is, can we reach our Buddhist friends and neighbors or get to know Buddhists and have a solid apologetic for them? And secondly, we have to be on our guard not to incorporate alien religious ideas into our Christian worldview, which is exceedingly common in the United States. If you've been following the Barna polls, Pew Research, the Gallup polls for the last 20, 30 years, as I have, you see repeatedly that people who identify as Christians often believe in very non-Christian things, like Jesus is really not the only way. Some Christians claim to believe in reincarnation, which is completely antithetical to the doctrine of resurrection. So we want to worship and honor the Lord in our thinking and in our acting. And before I continue to go, I'd like to read a passage that really made an imprint on me just as I was preparing this talk. It's a beautiful confession of Peter addressing the crowd in Acts 2, verse 22. Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. And we reflect on this during Holy Week and Good Friday especially. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. And we look forward to Easter. These credentials of Jesus are equaled by no one. This can be said of no one else in the history of the universe. Whether we're talking about Buddha or Muhammad or any sage or guru, or for that matter, any other well-accredited biblical character, any prophet, any priest. This is unique to the Lord Jesus Christ, and this happened in space-time history. But Buddhism, like Christianity, is a missionary religion, meaning it wants to make converts. Now, have you ever had a Buddhist come to your door and say, would you like to know more about the Buddha? I haven't. I've had Jehovah's Witnesses do that, and I've had Mormons say, would you like to know more about Jesus? That kind of thing. So even though it's a missionary religion, it's not as zealously missionary or as well represented in the United States as in other countries. But this supposedly was said by the Buddha, and I'll explain what that term means, Buddha, in a moment. Fare ye forth, brethren, on the mission that is for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, to take compassion to the world, to work for the profit and good and happiness of gods and men. Go singly, do not go in pairs. Interesting, different than Jesus where he said go 2 by 2. But this was spoken supposedly by the Buddha to his disciples, and here is really the root of Buddhism as a missionary religion that wants to go out into the world and spread what is called the Dharma. The Dharma means the teaching. In a way, it's similar to our idea of the gospel. It's in content radically different than the gospel of grace through Jesus Christ, but it's the focus. There is a Dharma to Buddhism that's really summed up in the Four Noble Truths, which I'll speak to in a moment. So let's talk about this man who is called the Buddha. There was a man who lived from about 560 to 480 BC in northern India named Siddhartha Gautama. And he was well off, was a young married man, and was in one of the upper castes of Hinduism. And he beheld 4 things that deeply troubled him. These are called the 4 sights. He beheld a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and an ascetic holy man. And so the 4 sights triggered in him the desire for enlightenment or liberation. Because what does this show us? People become sick, you get old, you die, and some people pursue holiness by being ascetics, by denying themselves. So he would have encountered some kind of a Hindu holy man or a guru. However, he was not content or satisfied with the teachings of Hinduism. So we are told that he left his family to pursue enlightenment. And Buddhists typically skip over this, but we have to ask a question right at the beginning. Is that a moral thing to do, to abandon your own family, a young family, in pursuit of enlightenment? So what he did was he pursued wisdom first as an ascetic, someone who denied himself pleasures and even normal clothing and the right amount of food. And the story is that he nearly died in the process, but he eventually attained enlightenment under a particular tree called the Bodhi tree, or the tree of enlightenment. Now, before I go on, we have to know something about Buddhism. The documents that tell us about Buddha and the teachings of Buddha date to about 400 or 500 years after he died. 400 or 500 years. Now, I think we can probably reconstruct the basic story of the 4 sights, the search for enlightenment, the claim to enlightenment, the early teachings. But we're in a very different position than we are with the New Testament, because all the Gospels are written in the 1st century, probably Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, probably written before 70 AD. The testimony of the Apostle Paul is in the 50s. The testimony of John may have been later, maybe in the 90s. I think it could be earlier. And so these are just a few decades after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, very well grounded in historical documents. The teachings of Buddha are really not. And what's the most important about Buddha is not any action that he performed. He died at about age 80, and the story is that he may have had food poisoning and died. And his last words were, "Seek enlightenment ardently," something like that. There's no record in the original sources that, even though they're old or far removed from the events they describe, of Buddha working miracles. There are some miracle stories, but they come hundreds and hundreds of years later. And the miracle stories are not intrinsic or necessary to Buddhism. What's necessary to Buddhism is what's called the Dharma, or the Four Noble Truths. And the historical teaching is that a man, Siddhartha Gautama, sought enlightenment and found enlightenment. So, how do we relate Siddhartha Gautama to Buddha? Buddha is a title. It's not a proper name. It means the enlightened one or one who woke up. Now, compare that to Jesus for a moment. We know of Jesus of Nazareth, and he has a title, and that is the Christ. The Christ. But unlike Buddha, Jesus never became anything he wasn't always. By that I mean, he wasn't a man who sought enlightenment because he desperately needed to know the answers to life, found enlightenment, and then got the title, the Christ. He was the Christ from conception. He was Messiah from conception. See, when you try to blend Christianity and Eastern religions, what people will often say is, well, Jesus is one of many enlightened beings. Like Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama became Buddha, Jesus became Christ. They might even say you can become a Christ if you seek enlightenment and find it within yourself. But that's really abusing the biblical language, and it's denying the biblical teaching, which is rooted in reliable first century sources. So when you talk about Jesus the Christ, this is very different than talking about Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha in terms of the identity of the figure, right? So in Buddhism, Buddha is considered not a prophet because Buddhism is not concerned with God. Buddhism is a religion that is not concerned with God. There are a few others that are not that directly concerned with God, but it is the largest world religion that has no concern whatsoever with God. Now, there is this idea of a sacred realm, so it's not like, let's say, Nietzschean atheism or the atheism of Richard Dawkins. The sacred realm, which we'll get to more in a minute, is called nirvana. And that's the place beyond the realm of striving and personality and individuality and matter and so on. But nirvana is not a he, but an it. It's a state that you could attain under the right conditions, and supposedly the Buddha entered nirvana. So the Buddha can't be a prophet because there's no word of the Lord, because there's no Lord. Now, Buddha can't be an incarnation because there's no concern with God. Now, the Buddha himself was probably atheistic. He might have been agnostic, but he thought that ideas on the creation of the world, whether the world's eternal or not, are not edifying. They're not profitable. And he used this image that everybody is suffering. We'll come to this. Suffering through sickness, suffering through age, people die, people suffer to try to find enlightenment. Life is suffering, is the first noble truth of Buddhism. And that's the problem to be addressed, not whether there's a God, not whether the universe is eternal or not. We have to deal with the suffering. And the image they typically use is if an arrow lodges in you, you don't worry about who shot the arrow or the identity of the person. You try to pull out the arrow so you won't be in agony. All right, so let's look at the Four Noble Truths. But we understand Buddha not as a prophet, not as an incarnation, but what you could call a sage. So a sage is a person who supposedly has deep, sacred wisdom about the nature of existence. Now, you could apply that category to Jesus. He was the most sagacious, wise person who ever lived. But of course, he was much more than that. He was a prophet. He was God incarnate. But for the Buddhist religion, the Buddha is only a sage. The Buddha is not a savior or Lord. The Buddha is not to be worshipped. In fact, nothing is to be worshipped on the Buddhist worldview. All right, so let's talk about the Four Noble Truths. But before we do, comments or questions so far? Just trying to set this up with the history, some comparisons, Jesus and Buddha?
I just have one.
Yes.
He said he tells them to go and basically spread their message of the good news.
Right.
But wouldn't that be a desire? Wouldn't that be a want to or a deep longing to do that?
You're already getting to the critique. Because on Buddhism, life is suffering and suffering is caused by desire. So if you're completely free of desire, why should you desire other people to hear and respond to the Dharma? So we'll get to that. You just can't keep that apologetic in check until we get to it, right? Yes, Bill.
My question, I guess, is like, how do they know? Well, first of all, there's been more than one Buddha, right?
Well, there's only one historical Buddha, but later Buddhism, called Mahayana Buddhism, developed the idea of the Bodhisattva, who is a person who could enter nirvana but decides not to help other people become enlightened. But historically, there's only one Buddha. But others can attain enlightenment, or others could refuse to go to nirvana, or to attain nirvana is a better way to put it, in order to help other people. That's called the Bodhisattva doctrine. That comes out of the later Mahayana version of Buddhism.
And then with reaching enlightenment, does that mean if they become enlightened, then they will attain nirvana?
Yes.
One and the same?
Right.
Then the other, like, how would they then know if the original Buddha became enlightened? Is this something that they could know before he died, and like you can't know if he's been reincarnated or is nirvana?
Well, Buddha can't be reincarnated because he attained nirvana. So it's like Hinduism in that you don't want to come back to this world anymore. You want to leave it alone. You want to transcend it. So the world of karma and reincarnation is called the wheel of samsara, the wheel of suffering. It's a very negative view of human material existence. It's not something that can be reformed or resurrected. It has to be left behind. So for Hinduism, it's called moksha, or their view term for enlightenment. In Buddhism, it's called nirvana. Actually, nirvana may have been used, probably was used in Hinduism first, and then the Buddhists used the term as well. There are different terms that are used. The main term in Buddhism is nirvana. The Zen Buddhists talk about enlightenment as satori. Okay, so let me go on and develop the ideas. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much. So, what is the essence of Buddhist teaching, or the core? As I mentioned, there's no necessary reference to God or gods. There are gods that show up in some Buddhist stories, but they're not saviors, they're not revelators, they're more like mythical accoutrements. What really matters to Buddhism is the Dharma. So here it is. The first truth of the Four Noble Truths, not to be confused with the Campus Crusade tract, is life is suffering. Life is suffering, or dukkha, suffering. Now let me give you an account by a Buddhist scholar named Bart Gruzowski, who wrote a book called On the Buddha. And this was part of a series that came out about 25 years ago. I wrote 2 books in this series, one called On Jesus and one called On Pascal. But the editor of the series wanted adherents of the different religions and philosophies to write on their particular philosopher. So Bart wrote this little volume called On the Buddha. And he says this: the Buddha's statement of the First Noble Truth does not take a personal perspective. The Buddha did not say we suffer or each of us suffers and then point to birth, illness, separation, death, and all the rest. Instead, he said there is suffering. He did not say it was mine or yours or that it belonged to anyone. He did not blame suffering on anyone. The First Noble Truth makes a straightforward observation. There is suffering. In the same way that rain occurs, the winds blow, and the sun rises and sets daily, so too suffering occurs as part of the web of life. Interesting. So, as Christians, we tend to think as human beings who have tremendous value, and we suffer, and we try to alleviate suffering. That's because we're monotheists, and because we believe there's a personal God, and we're made in the image and likeness of God, and we should have compassion on our fellow image bearers. That's not a part of Buddhism. And Grzelski really explains this here. There is suffering. No one's to blame, but suffering is as natural as the wind or the waves. That's just the way the world is. Now you want to escape it, and you have to escape it by understanding what the root of it is. So suffering is caused by desire or craving. And this is a pretty solid insight psychologically, isn't it? You think of so much of our suffering is if we don't feel well, we want to be stronger. If we have muscle cramps, as I get older, I complain about this, you want them to go away. I don't want to wake up with these horrible muscle cramps. I want them to go away. I'm desiring them to dissipate. Or I'm desiring something that I don't have. Or a relationship goes bad, you want it to be better, you don't have enough money, you want more money. So basically you have what you don't want, or you want what you don't have. A lot of suffering can be summarized in those categories. So you desire something that you don't have, and so you suffer. Now, there's some debate over the proper understanding of the second noble truth. Does it mean all desire, or does it mean a kind of lustful desire, or what could be called craving? Because if you think all desire is the root of suffering and it has to be eliminated, then how can you really act at all? What's your structure of motivation for anything without desire? So I come to this class because I desire to teach, and I do the things necessary to teach the class. How would I do anything if I had no, let's say, will to do anything? Nothing would happen. So it could be that this idea is more like craving, or if we deeply desire something and we don't have it, we suffer. So the third noble truth, we're not dealing with the four spiritual laws here. The third noble truth is suffering can only be alleviated through the cessation of desire or craving. So life is suffering. That typifies, that categorizes existence in this impersonal kind of way for Buddhism. It's caused by, let's call it craving. All right. How do we deal with the cause? We've got to eliminate the cause to eliminate the effect. That makes sense so far. So it can only be alleviated through what's called the cessation of craving. So you've got to stop craving. If you stop craving, you won't suffer not having what you want and having what you don't want. So in order to achieve this is the fourth noble truth, we have to detach from the world of suffering. We have to free ourselves from our grasping and desiring to have and control and possess and arrange the world our way. We have to let go in terms of not being concerned and attached to it. You might be thinking, well, isn't this a little bit like the Christian idea of putting everything in God's hands? No. Why? There's no God in Buddhism. Details. There's no God. You don't let go and let God. It's just let go. Let go and there's no God. You have to be so careful that you don't take ideas from one religion and understand them in terms of another religion. That's just a basic category confusion. It happens all the time. So, the fourth noble truth is we have to detach. And our essential problem is attachment through craving. It's called the Eightfold Path. And instead of listing the 8 elements of the path that will lead you to detachment and eventually you hope to nirvana, let me summarize it in 3 categories. It has to do with moral conduct, right speech, right action, right livelihood. So actually, I am going to get to all 8, but in 3 categories. Mental discipline is the second, right effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And 3, wisdom, right thought, and right understanding. So this is a process by which you attempt to free yourself of craving. If you are successful, you can escape the world of suffering. So you're here in this world because of karma and reincarnation. And the idea is to get free from it entirely, not to get a lot of good karma so you come back with a happier life, but rather to utterly transcend this world of life and death and rebirth and redeath. That's the goal. So in that way, it's very similar to Hinduism. Now, what is this nirvana? Buddhists are typically reluctant to say much about it. And there's good reason for that, because it's really understood in terms of negation, not affirmation. So let's jump to the biblical God for a minute. The God of the Bible is the ultimate affirmation. I am who I am. And Jesus says before Abraham was, I am. God is the source of all being and goodness. In Buddhism, it's a cutting away, it's a paring back, it's a removal. So you remove craving, you remove personality, you remove individuality. So it's a state beyond humanity as we typically understand humanity. So they can't really report much about it. It's put mostly in terms of what it is not. It's not craving, it's not the human world, it's not individual beings, it's not a person, place, or thing. Nirvana is not a community. It's not being with anyone. And it's not total extinction either. All right, so let's consider Hinduism and Buddhism in contrast. Hinduism, as I mentioned, is a big tent. It includes pantheism and panentheism and even polytheism. There are different schools of Buddhism, or Hinduism rather. And last time I talked about this, I think it was the 6 basic things that all Hindus have in common. But one of the items that you have to believe as a Hindu, 2 of them actually, Buddha denied. He denied the sacred nature of the Vedas, the 4 Vedas, and he denied the legitimacy of a caste system. That's enough to get you kicked out of Hinduism. So while Hinduism has many what are called avatars or periodic manifestations of God, you can't make Buddha one of them because he denied 2 essential features, crucial features of Hinduism. He also denied something that's very common in Hinduism, but not universal, the idea of the absolute or universal self or Brahman. And let me dilate a little bit here on the Buddhist sense of the self. It's very, to most of us, odd or seems counterintuitive. Part of detaching from the world of desire or craving is to deny the reality of a self. So we tend to think of ourselves as individual beings that persist through time, who have certain desires, who want certain things and don't want other things. So we try to satisfy the self through food, through relationships, through achievements. Buddhism says you don't have a unitary self. That's actually an illusion. You are, rather, a collection of states or skandhas. So you're more like the parts of a chariot. This is the image they use often. So you say, well, what's the essence of the chariot? What's the unifying element to the chariot? And the story is, well, there isn't any. There are wheels, there's an axle, there's a seat, there are other parts of a chariot, but a chariot is a collection of parts. It's not a unitary entity. Now you could actually debate that, but that's the image that they use. So, for the self, you think you are an ego, a conscious entity that remains the same in some sense over time. This is the idea of the self as a substance, which we have in Scripture. It's also really, I think, more the philosophically defensible view. And they say you're not a self. So the way to attain nirvana is to free yourself from craving and to try to deny the self as a self. It's called, not amazingly, the no-self teaching. Okay. If this sounds odd or different, it is. The self as an ontological continuing entity is unreal. We are really a collection of states. All right, so let's talk about Buddhism and badness. The first noble truth is life is suffering. And as Gruzalski says, it's kind of an impersonal sense. Suffering is, like the wind is, like the waves are, like foliage occurs. It's just suffering. It's not that human beings have sinned against God or have been punished by God. There's no sense of creation or fall here. It's just a way of redemption to escape the world of suffering. So how does Buddhism understand badness? It has nothing to say about the origin of suffering. Zero. Nor does it claim to make people happier ultimately. Now, Buddhism teaches mindfulness, which can help you to relax and not be so overwrought or frustrated with not achieving things. As Buddhist meditations involve things like letting go of your desires and just watching your emotions flow. Don't judge anything. This is a really bad idea, by the way, because we need to take every thought captive to obey Christ. And when you start detaching from judgments and just kind of going with the flow of consciousness, you know who loves that? Satan and demons. Like, open the door. No, we have to take every thought captive to obey Christ, love God with our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And I don't have time to develop a biblical view of rest and a biblical view of meditation, but it's always cognitive. It's reflecting on the truths of God in the proper way. It's not emptying your mind of content or emptying your mind of rational processes. That's not it. So, according to Buddhism, suffering must be transcended, and it can't be ultimately transcended in this world. So the goal is to attain nirvana, attain enlightenment, such that when you die, you will not have to come back to the wheel of suffering. Now, Buddhism talks a lot about compassion, and in the original quote, it talks about to work for the profit and good and happiness of gods and men. But that's not the final state. It's not even happiness, because happiness would be an individual experiencing pleasure about something, and that's all denied or transcended in nirvana. So, you could say the problem with the world is the world. The problem with the world is the world. Now, from a biblical viewpoint, the problem with the world is sin. The world is fallen. It's originally good, and very good, God says on the sixth day. And the problem is demonic and human rebellion against God. Good is original and transcendent, and what is bad and evil is a defection from the good. Now, some contemporary thinkers try to appropriate Buddhism without all the elements, even all the essential elements of Buddhism. They say, well, we think the Buddhist idea of the self is something we can't quite embrace. We don't think there's really a nirvana. Reincarnation and karma, those are sort of mythical stories of Buddhism. What we really like is the teaching of mindfulness. Well, it's not Buddhism then. Because Buddhism takes you into these other areas. That's sort of Buddhism on the cheap. So you've got various psychologists and others that claim that they're Buddhists, but they're denying essential aspects of Buddhism. Now, I said the problem with the world is the world. I want to go back to a reference to one of the most famous Buddhists in the world, the Dalai Lama, who is a Tibetan Buddhist. But the Dalai Lama, by virtue of his position, has to be celibate. And he was asked in an interview, well, you're a man, do you ever struggle with desires for women? And you have to be celibate in your position. He said, well, I sometimes do, but I try to imagine them as corpses. Yeah, exactly, the yuck response. All right, why would he have that response as a Buddhist to sexual temptation? I imagine them as corpses. Any ideas? Everything is passing away. Everything is decaying. It's the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence. Everything is a collection of states. Nothing is substantial. Nothing endures forever. Everything is passing away. And so you don't want to put your affections on anything in this world. It's not like there's good affection and there's bad affection. So he immediately goes to death and decay as a way of dealing with his lust. I wouldn't recommend this to anybody in terms of dealing with lustful thoughts. It's a very Buddhist way of addressing this problem. Everything is passing away. Suffering is based on craving. You have no craving for a corpse. All right, so we don't have much time left, but I want to talk about Jesus and Buddha on suffering and salvation. Of course, the Buddha did not believe in God, did not claim to be a God, was not a savior figure. He's more like an example of what you could attain. He got the Dharma down. He made the Dharma known. We can see him as an example and follow his teaching. But he's not going to help us because he's dead and in nirvana. He's not there to help anybody. Now, later forms of Buddhism, I don't have time to get into this, later forms of Buddhism try to personalize and make help available. Because the original Buddhism, it's called Theravada or Hinayana Buddhism, is just cut to the bone. It's you have to renounce everything, and there's no help from anybody. Strive ceaselessly for enlightenment, to attain nirvana. Later Buddhism comes up with this idea of the bodhisattva, where someone could attain nirvana but stays around to help other people attain nirvana. And the Buddha becomes a kind of savior figure in some, at least folk Buddhism and so on. But I'm trying to understand Buddhism as best I can from the original teaching and the original worldview. So let's compare Jesus and Buddha for a moment. Jesus was obviously a monotheist. He didn't say, well, it doesn't matter whether there's a God or not, or whether the world is eternal or not. There is a God. He created the world. And God is a personal and infinite being. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, and you shall serve the Lord with all of your being. Jesus believed that God had revealed himself in the Hebrew Bible and in Jesus himself. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, Jesus said. He endorses the Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly. I've got some text there. Jesus believed we are creatures made in the image of God. He doesn't repeat that statement, we're made in the image of God, but in Matthew 19, 1 through 4, he goes back to the Genesis narrative when he's asked a question about divorce. So he presupposes we're made in the image and likeness of God, that we have fallen into sin. There's something wrong with the world, and it's abnormal, you could say. The world as it now is abnormal in that it doesn't fit the original divine plan. So it has to be brought back to where it originally was. Something has to be rectified. It's not, well, suffering is, and so we have to transcend it. There is suffering, struggle, pain, death. Why? Because sin entered the world through human rebellion. And actually before that, through the rebellion of some of the angels. Fifth, we need redemption. So many passages there, but I think of the great statement of Jesus after he has this encounter with Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus repents and he's going to restore what he's stolen from people. And Jesus says, salvation has come to this house. The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. So there's a lot of language for who we are as humans east of Eden. We're lost, we're sinners, we're rebels, but it all says we're in need of rescue and redemption. And this is not going to come from within yourself. It's not going to come through some kind of psychological or behavioral discipline. It's going to come from the top down, from God's grace that we receive by faith. And it comes through the agency of God himself, God sending the Son obeying the Father, dying, rising, living forever, and the Spirit making that known to us. So let me give you a story from a Buddhist poet named Issa, and I've got this in more detail in the book. I read this so many years ago in a classic book by Os Guinness about the counterculture called The Dust of Death. Anyone read that book, by the way, Os Guinness, The Dust of Death? Good for you. Got some old veteran apologists in here. But this is a book, came out in 1973. It was a critique of the counterculture. And one of the chapters was called The East, No Exit. And it was a critique of some of the essential ideas of Eastern mysticism. And Oz relates a story of a poet named Issa who suffered a lot in his life. And eventually his wife and I think one or more of his children died. And he was grieving terribly. And he went to a Zen master to know how to address his suffering. And the Zen master said, life is due, D-E-W, life is due, meaning it's like that first quote I read from Grzelski. There is suffering, there is wind, there is rain, people die. Life is due. It's here and it passes away. So just let go and not let God. Let go, full stop. So Issa returned and wrote a poem that said, life is due, and yet, and yet. The and yet indicates his inability to treat his wife and children as due. His humanity was crying out against the Buddhism, because the Buddhism was saying, suffering exists, you're not even a self, everything is impermanent, life is due, let it all go. And yet, you see, his humanity was rebelling against the teaching because he loved his family and he lost his family, and it's deeply human to grieve the loss of a loved one. And there's another story. I relate this in my book also. It's in the book by Bart Grzelski on the Buddha, where a mother came to the Buddha and she was grieving terribly because she lost an infant. And it's just a tragic story. She's actually carrying the body of the infant around with her. She just can't let go. And so the Buddha says, go to all the surrounding villages and ask every household if they've ever lost a loved one to death, and come back and report to me. So she goes into the community, goes to all the households, and of course every household has lost someone to death. And so the Buddha says, you see, life is impermanent, death occurs, let go. So the story is that she realized the impermanence, the naturalness of death, and then she had her baby incinerated. All right, compare that to the story in John 11 of Jesus and Lazarus. It's so rich. You could preach at least 3 or 4 sermons on John 11. But this is the point I want to make, the difference between Jesus and Buddha. Jesus wept at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. He wept, and he wasn't ashamed to weep. Now, weeping over death is really not a good Buddhist kind of practice. You should be detached from it.